Evening and welcome. The President Trump-led trade war rocking both friends and foes.
Germany has launched a devastating economic counterstrike that's crippling the U.S. auto industry. You've probably noticed it already. Car prices are spiking, dealerships are empty, and wait times for new vehicles are stretching into months. But here's what most people don't know. This isn't just inflation. This is a full-scale supply chain war. And Germany just fired the first shot. While American leaders were focused on tariffs, Germany quietly did something far more dangerous. They shut down the flow of high-precision parts that U.S. automakers depend on. We're talking about critical German-made components, high-performance transmissions, electronic control units, turbochargers, and fuel injection systems. Behind the scenes, Germany targeted the very systems that keep the U.S. auto industry alive. And within weeks, the results are already showing. Stalled production, canceled orders, skyrocketing prices, and tens of thousands of jobs on the line. What happens to your retirement when auto stocks crash? How much more will you pay for your next car? And is your job safe if this keeps spreading? Wall Street hits the panic button. When Germany executed its counterstrike, the tremors didn't stop at the factory floor. They surged straight into America's financial heart. Shares of major U.S. automakers plunged. General Motors shed billions in market value in a matter of days. Ford's stock hit its lowest level in years. Even Tesla, once considered untouchable, took a hit as investors braced for supply chain chaos and retaliatory tariffs. The entire sector turned radioactive. But the collapse didn't stop with car makers. Suppliers, software firms, and logistics companies saw their valuations crumble. Investment funds dumped auto-related holdings. Pension plans absorbed losses. Hedge funds pulled out. Credit ratings wobbled. Lenders tightened terms. The message was clear. This wasn't a temporary disruption. It was a structural breakdown. Across America, consumers who once saw the trade war as distant political theater were now feeling its sting up close. Dealership lots, once brimming with options, sat half empty. Transport trucks stopped arriving. Popular models vanished from inventory. Customers were told to wait 3 to 6 months for new cars, or longer. Some were simply turned away. And then came the price hikes. With supply shrinking and demand holding steady, prices skyrocketed. Entry-level sedans jumped by thousands of dollars. Used cars, some with more miles than cents, sold for more than they had brand new. For families shopping for a first vehicle or a reliable second car, the market had become a minefield. But the shockwaves didn't just rattle Wall Street. They hit hardest where the American auto story began. And the fallout? It's rewriting the legacy of a city that once ruled the world. The fall of Detroit's influence. For over a century, Detroit wasn't just a city. It was the beating heart of American manufacturing. The Motor City. The birthplace of mass production. The blueprint for industrial dominance. But as global power shifted and the trade war deepened, Detroit's influence began to unravel. Major auto executives, once the most powerful voices in Washington, found themselves sidelined. Congressional hearings that once opened with their testimony were now led by tech CEOs and semiconductor lobbyists. Even within the White House, focus had shifted toward electric infrastructure, AI policy, and battery minerals, areas where Detroit lagged behind. As international partnerships crumbled and supply lines choked, factories across Michigan and the Rust Belt went eerily quiet. Small towns that depended on assembly plants began to collapse. Local governments scrambled to offset the losses. But tax revenue dried up. Schools closed. Services vanished. It represented more than just an economic change. It was a powerful symbol. The American auto industry was no longer the centerpiece of the national economy. And Detroit, once the empire's capital, had become its cautionary tale. And America's automakers had only one place left to turn: Washington. Bailout or bust? Desperate times call for desperate measures. As the trade war dragged on, and the effects compounded across every layer of the auto industry, major American automakers did what once seemed unthinkable. They returned to Washington, hats in hand. Executives from Ford, General Motors, and even Tesla began quietly lobbying lawmakers for emergency subsidies, low-interest loans, and supply chain support. They argued that without swift federal assistance, the industry could face irreversible damage. job losses in the hundreds of thousands, plant closures, supplier bankruptcies, and long-term loss of competitiveness on the global stage. But the political landscape had changed. Memories of the 2008 bailouts were still fresh. So were the resentments. Lawmakers were divided. Some viewed the automakers as victims of geopolitical warfare, deserving of help. Others saw them as arrogant multinationals who had failed to diversify supply chains and were now asking taxpayers to clean up their mess. The White House found itself in a bind. Supporting the bailouts risked political backlash. Refusing them risked an economic spiral. Talks began. Proposals floated. Emergency committees formed. But time was running out. This wasn't just a financial dilemma. It was a moral one. Should a nation rescue an industry that had failed to prepare for the very global instability it now blamed? Or should it protect the jobs, the factories, and the fragile communities that depended on them? As the debate raged, one truth was becoming painfully clear. The collapse was no longer just economic. It was existential. Germany's pivot to China. As the trade war between the United States and Germany escalated, a quiet but profound shift began to unfold on the global chessboard. Germany, once a staunch ally of American industry and a key player in the transatlantic trade system, began turning eastward, and not just diplomatically, but economically, strategically, and with breathtaking speed. China had long been positioning itself as the future epicenter of global commerce. With its massive consumer base, growing middle class, and aggressive investments in electric vehicles and green technologies, it was already the largest car market in the world. Germany, facing increasing friction with the United States and eager to shield itself from future trade disruptions, saw an opportunity and seized it. German automakers wasted no time. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Volkswagen announced new joint ventures with Chinese firms, signing multi-billion-dollar deals to co-develop battery technology, autonomous driving software, and shared vehicle platforms tailored for the Chinese market. These partnerships went far beyond simple exports. They included co-production, technology licensing, and the establishment of state-of-the-art research and development centers within China's major industrial zones. It wasn't just about growth, it was about resilience. Germany was diversifying its dependence on the United States by locking in long-term supply chain security with Beijing, lithium for batteries, semiconductors for EVs, rare earth metals, all the critical materials needed to dominate the next generation of vehicles, would now flow through channels aligned with China, not the US. This new alliance between Germany and China sent shockwaves through the automotive world. Not just because of what it represented, a reordering of power, but because of how smoothly it was executed. The pivot wasn't reactive. It was calculated. Decades of engineering excellence from Germany were now being paired with China's market scale and industrial might. And while Germany and China moved forward in lockstep, the United States found itself increasingly surrounded and alarmingly alone. The new Auto Cold War. What emerged next was not a trade dispute. It was something deeper, more systemic, and more dangerous. A new Auto Cold War had begun. One that pitted two economic blocs against each other with clashing ideologies, competing alliances, and increasingly incompatible strategies. On one side stood the emerging axis of China and the European Union, with Germany at the forefront. This alliance controlled the largest EV market on the planet, vast mineral resources, and a vertically integrated supply chain stretching from Southeast Asia to Eastern Europe. Their vision was clear: a globally connected, technologically advanced auto industry driven by clean energy and built to scale. On the other side was the United States, once the cradle of automotive innovation, now fighting to hold on to its market share, struggling to retain its allies, and facing unprecedented internal division over how to proceed. As Germany aligned with China, the United States scrambled to reinforce its trade relationships with allies like Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Canada. But the old trust was gone. What had once been a unified trade vision was now splintering. International forums turned cold. Trade summits that once focused on cooperation began to feel more like standoffs. New bilateral agreements between European and Asian countries explicitly excluded U.S. companies. Regulations were rewritten. Tariff structures were redrawn. the U.S. found itself locked out of key electric vehicle supply deals, rare earth contracts, and battery development partnerships. And the technology divide was growing. Europe and China pushed ahead with unified standards for autonomous vehicle communication protocols, battery interoperability, and carbon-neutral manufacturing practices. Meanwhile, the United States lagged behind, trying to defend legacy infrastructure and increasingly outdated regulatory frameworks. This Cold War wasn't fought with missiles. It was fought with semiconductors, patents, and trade corridors. And just like the ideological Cold War of the 20th century, this one had far-reaching implications beyond the automotive industry. Control over transportation technology meant control over data, mobility infrastructure, and smart city development. It meant influence over the future of global commerce. American policymakers began to acknowledge, privately at first and then more publicly, that they were falling behind. In congressional hearings, CEOs testified about losing access to key markets. Analysts spoke of a permanent loss in competitiveness. Diplomats tried to reassure international partners that America would not retreat from the world stage. But the narrative had already changed. The Cold War had begun, and the United States had entered late. And as the geopolitical blocs hardened, old alliances began to fracture under the strain. America's global reputation crumbles. The United States has long built its strength on more than just economics. It built it on trust, on reliability, on the promise that when America signed a deal, it would stand by it. But the sudden imposition of tariffs, the aggressive rhetoric, and the chaos that followed had shaken that reputation to its core. Across the Pacific, Japan began reevaluating its position. For decades, their automakers had flourished in the U.S. market. Honda, Toyota, and Nissan had massive manufacturing hubs in states like Ohio, Kentucky, and Alabama. But those operations were now threatened by unstable trade conditions, parts bottlenecks, and growing uncertainty around future U.S. policy. Japanese executives began redirecting future investment towards Southeast Asia and even Europe, where regulatory environments were becoming more predictable and cooperation more reliable. South Korea, too, took notice. Hyundai and Kia, already investing heavily in EVs, began shifting R&D resources away from joint U.S. projects. They sought new alliances with German firms, creating tech-sharing agreements and joint battery factories on European soil. But perhaps the most jarring change came from south of the border. Mexico, one of America's closest trade partners, and a critical hub for North American auto manufacturing, signaled frustration. Tariff changes had disrupted its cross-border supply chains. Mexican political leaders began exploring stronger trade ties with the European Union and China, raising alarms in Washington. What once looked like an unbreakable network of American trade partners now looked shaky, fragmented, and suspicious. Countries that had previously leaned on U.S. industrial might were now hedging their bets, moving cautiously, and seeking alternatives. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The United States was no longer the dependable partner it once claimed to be. This shift went beyond contracts. It was cultural. Economic nationalism in the U.S. had reawakened nationalism elsewhere. Countries were looking inward, prioritizing their domestic industries, building self-sufficiency, and retreating from the idea of one cohesive global supply chain. America had not only lost ground, it had lost credibility. And with allies drifting and confidence collapsing, one question remained: could diplomacy salvage what was left? Can diplomacy fix this? As the economic fallout deepened, the diplomatic efforts finally began. High-level talks were scheduled between Washington and Brussels. Envoys met in neutral territories: Geneva, Vienna, and eventually Berlin. Behind closed doors, negotiators from both sides tried to undo the damage, walk back the rhetoric, and piece together a path forward. But the talks were tense. Distrust ran deep. Germany, emboldened by its partnership with China and backed by a resilient European bloc, was in no hurry to capitulate. European negotiators demanded not just a rollback of tariffs, but firm commitments to prevent future economic aggression. They wanted assurances, legally binding ones, that the United States would no longer weaponize trade policy in a unilateral fashion. The White House, under pressure from domestic automakers and voters, was divided. Some advisors pushed for a conciliatory approach, urging a return to traditional alliances and multilateral trade deals. Others insisted that any backpedaling would look weak and that America needed to stand firm to protect its sovereignty and industrial base. The debate spilled into public view. Cable news aired dueling narratives. One side claimed diplomacy was the only way forward. The other warned that giving in to Germany and the EU would signal defeat. In Congress, lawmakers clashed over resolutions, stimulus packages, and trade reform proposals. The political temperature rose with every hearing, every press conference, every leaked memo. Meanwhile, the auto industry waited in limbo. Production schedules remained paused. Contracts hung in the balance. Foreign buyers held off on new deals, watching the negotiations with cautious interest. Every delay in diplomacy meant another month of uncertainty for workers, suppliers, and engineers. By the time a framework for de-escalation was proposed, the damage had already reshaped the landscape. Even if the tariffs were lifted, even if embargoes were reversed, the geopolitical axis had shifted. Germany and China had built something durable. American reputation had been bruised. The supply chains that once defined the auto world were never going back to the way they were. Diplomacy, it seemed, could patch the wounds, but not erase the scars. And while the negotiations continued behind closed doors, other nations were already stepping into the power vacuum left behind. Mexico's retaliation. It caught Washington off guard. While the headlines focused on Germany and the European Union, Mexico quietly prepared its own response to the United States' protectionist shift. And when it arrived, it was both swift and symbolic. In response to the tariffs imposed by the U.S. on a variety of Mexican-made goods, including autos and electronics, Mexico struck back where it would be felt most viscerally: agriculture. The Mexican government announced a sweeping set of tariffs on American corn, wheat, soybeans, and dairy, commodities that represent the economic lifeblood of vast stretches of the American Midwest. The consequences were immediate. U.S. farmers who had long relied on Mexico as one of their top buyers suddenly found themselves locked out of a critical export market. Orders dried up, shipments stalled, produce prices began to fall, silos and storage facilities overflowed with excess inventory. Rural economies, already fragile from inflation and market volatility, started to bend under the pressure. But Mexico didn't stop there. In a move that stunned many industry insiders, it also paused certain assembly exports. This included halting shipment of auto parts that were bound for U.S. factories. While not a full embargo, it was enough to cause delays in vehicle assembly across plants in Texas, Arizona, and the Midwest. Mexico had long been one of the United States' most integrated manufacturing partners, serving as a crucial link in just-in-time production models that the U.S. auto industry depended on. Disrupting that rhythm sent tremors through every major carmaker. This retaliation also marked a turning point. Unlike Germany's strategy, which was rooted in high-tech industrial leverage, Mexico's counterstrike was agricultural and logistic. It showed that retaliation didn't require precision. It just needed to hit where it hurt, and it did. But Mexico wasn't the only country acting. As America's policies pushed away old friends, other global powers began to reevaluate their loyalties and their strategies. Japan and South Korea rethink the deal. Long seen as two of the United States' most dependable partners, Japan and South Korea had built lasting alliances, not only in defense, but also across major industries. These were countries that built deep, decades-long partnerships with American manufacturers. Their tech companies, auto giants, and electronics firms worked hand-in-hand with Silicon Valley and Detroit alike. But now, with global trade tensions rising, that loyalty was beginning to shift. Executives in Tokyo and Seoul began having serious conversations about risk, and increasingly the United States was being seen not as a stable anchor, but as a volatile partner. Trade unpredictability, tariff threats, and domestic political infighting had eroded the confidence that once underpinned trans-Pacific economic ties. In Japan, major corporations like Toyota, Sony, and Panasonic began redirecting portions of their future investment away from the U.S. and into Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines were suddenly attractive alternatives, offering cheaper labor, growing markets, and far fewer geopolitical headaches. South Korea followed suit. Companies like Hyundai, LG, and Samsung started expanding their operations in Europe and India, while trimming their American manufacturing commitments. Some quietly delayed previously announced U.S. factory expansions. Others renegotiated existing contracts to allow for more flexibility. just in case tensions escalated further. Behind closed doors, government officials in both countries expressed concern about the long-term direction of U.S. policy. If trade relations continued to sour, it would not just affect business, it would affect regional diplomacy, supply chain security, and strategic defense arrangements. As American partnerships fray in the East, another sleeping giant begins to shift its weight, quietly but decisively. India's silent realignment. Unlike Germany, Mexico, or Japan, India did not make headlines with its retaliation. There were no fiery statements or bold embargoes. Instead, India responded in a way that was far more subtle and perhaps far more dangerous. As tensions between the United States and its trade partners escalated, India took the opportunity to strengthen ties with both the European Union and China. In a series of quiet but impactful trade agreements, India expanded its automotive and pharmaceutical partnerships with European firms. It increased its joint ventures with German engineering companies. It also signed new export contracts for generic drugs and chemical precursors with Chinese buyers. The goal was simple: diversify away from the United States. American firms operating in India began to feel the shift. Regulatory approvals took longer. Tax incentives once offered to U.S. companies were quietly reassigned to domestic players or European investors. In some cases, infrastructure projects with U.S. tech partners were postponed or canceled entirely. There were no sanctions, no tariffs, just a slow turning away. For Indian policymakers, the move was part of a larger vision. India sees itself as a rising economic superpower and dependency on any single nation, especially one engaged in trade wars with half the world, was increasingly seen as a liability. By pivoting toward a multipolar trade model, India positioned itself as a neutral bridge between East and West, and in doing so, it left American firms increasingly on the sidelines. The message was quiet but unmistakable. In a world shifting toward multipolar trade, the United States would have to earn its place rather than assume it. As country after country adjusted their strategies, one reality became impossible to ignore. America's era of economic dominance was no longer guaranteed. But what if these countries weren't just pulling away from the U.S.? What if they were building something of their own? A new kind of industrial alliance, one that doesn't answer to Washington, Berlin, or Beijing. The rise of a new industrial alliance. As the global economic order splintered, another unexpected shift began to take shape, one that defied the traditional East versus West narrative. In regions once overlooked by global manufacturing giants, a new coalition of rising industrial powers started quietly forging their own future. Led by countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates, this emerging bloc rejected the binary choice between aligning with the United States or the Germany-China axis. Instead, they began building a third way, focusing on regional self-sufficiency, resource sharing, and tech collaboration, tailored to their own markets. What started as scattered bilateral trade agreements quickly evolved into something larger. Brazil partnered with Turkey to co-develop alternative EV platforms for Latin America and Africa. Indonesia and the UAE signed long-term agreements on rare earth refining and battery recycling. Even Saudi Arabia stepped in, announcing a state-backed initiative to build a regional EV brand powered entirely by Middle Eastern supply chains. These nations weren't trying to challenge the giants head-on, they were building around them. By pooling resources, localizing production, and investing in digital infrastructure, they created insulated trade corridors that bypassed traditional manufacturing hubs. The results were striking: faster production cycles, lower costs, and fewer geopolitical entanglements. For U.S. automakers, this development posed a new kind of threat, one that couldn't be countered with tariffs or military alliances. These countries weren't retaliating, they were simply moving on. They were building industries that didn't depend on Detroit, Berlin, or Beijing. And investors were taking notice. Sovereign wealth funds, once heavily tied to Wall Street, began redirecting billions into regional development banks and infrastructure bonds across the global south. Venture capital followed. Startups from Lagos to Jakarta attracted global attention with innovations in lightweight electric vehicles, alternative battery chemistries, and modular vehicle design. This wasn't just a supply chain adjustment. It was the rise of a new industrial order, one that redefined what economic power looked like in the 21st century. And for the United States, it raised an uncomfortable question. What if the future of the auto industry doesn't run through Washington? or even Berlin or Beijing, but through Sao Paulo, Riyadh, and Jakarta. And just when it seemed like the global power shift couldn't get any worse, another force accelerated the divide. And this time, it wasn't a country, it was a code. The AI shockwave hits manufacturing. Just as the dust began to settle from global trade wars and supply chain collapses, another disruptive force slammed into the auto industry: artificial intelligence. And this time, it wasn't geopolitical, it was technological. While the United States struggled to recover production, Germany and China were quietly deploying next-generation AI systems to automate everything, from vehicle design to factory workflows. Entire assembly lines were reprogrammed with AI-driven robotics that cut labor costs, slashed downtime, and eliminated human error. China's largest EV factories began using predictive AI to optimize parts sourcing and shipping schedules, completing cars faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than ever before. In Germany, generative AI was deployed in design studios to produce new vehicle models in a fraction of the time it once took. The result? A widening gap, not just in manufacturing power, but in innovation speed. Meanwhile, American factories remained stuck in transition. Older infrastructure, union negotiations, and limited investment slowed the adoption of full AI integration. Some plants experimented, but few had scaled. The irony was brutal. The country that once led the digital revolution was now trailing in the most advanced form of digital manufacturing. And the threat wasn't just about falling behind. It was about never catching up, because in the AI age, speed compounds. The faster you build, the faster you learn. The faster you learn, the harder you are to catch. For the US auto industry, the message was clear. The future wasn't waiting. And now the question is yours. Is America ready for this new era, or already too far behind? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.